I have this wonderful pleasure this morning, and you can already hear from my accent that part of the conversation we've had over the last 24 hours as we've been together is whether we need translation services in this presentation today. But it is my sincere pleasure to welcome today His Excellency Dennis Richardson, Ambassador from Australia to the US. Dennis Richardson became Ambassador of Australia to the United States on July 11, 2005. Ambassador Richardson has been a career public servant since 1969 when he joined the Australian Foreign Service, serving posts in Nairobi, Port Moresby and Jakarta. From October 1996 until his current appointment, he served as Director General of the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation, before which he was Deputy Secretary of the Department of Immigration and Multicultural Affairs. Ambassador Richardson has also served in various senior public service roles in the departments of the Prime Minister and Cabinet, Foreign Affairs and Trade and Immigration. He was head of the review of the intelligence community post-Cold War in 1992 and principal advisor to the Prime Minister from 1990 to 91. Ambassador Richardson holds a bachelor's degree with honours from Sydney University and was made an Officer of the Order of Australia in 2003. He is married to Betty, who is here with us as well, and we're delighted to have her with us with one son and a daughter. Now that's the material that is read in introducing a diplomatic officer such as Dennis Richardson. But on a personal note, I've spent the last few hours with them. Both he and his wife are remarkably well-read and aware individuals. They have an awareness of this country that I think is tremendous, and I hope that you'll take advantage of that opportunity when question time comes at the end of his presentation. I welcome His Excellency Dennis Richardson, Ambassador from Australia to the US.
Thanks very much, Campbell. Betty and I are delighted to be here at the Kennedy Centre, where it's a real honour to be here at a university which has an international reputation and which has an outstanding reputation within this country. And I know that a lot of you, if you haven't already been overseas, a lot of you will be going overseas. It's a university which engages with the international community. I just thought I would speak for about 20-25 minutes, allow lots of opportunity for questioning. Very happy to take questions on anything at the end of it. I thought I'd say something about a few things about Australia, make a couple of points about Australia-US, and talk about the things that are of strategic importance to the Australian Embassy in Washington. Now, Australia's like any other country. Where we are in 2007 is essentially a product of our history, of our geography, of our economy, and also of our people. In terms of history, when you guys decided you want to be independent in 1776, it meant that Great Britain lost its penal colony in Georgia, and that meant that Great Britain needed to find another penal colony. And so the British established a penal colony in Australia in 1788, and that led to some further interesting linkages. If you go to Helena, the capital of Montana, you'll see that out the front of the Congress, Capitol building in Helena, is a fellow who sits on a horse, and his name is General Thomas Marr, and he was the first governor of Montana. And before being the first governor of Montana, he was a general in the Union Army. He fought in most of the big Civil War campaigns, and he was also a pallbearer at Lincoln's funeral. And before being a general in the Union Army, he was a lawyer in New York. And before being a lawyer in New York, he was an escaped convict from Australia. He was an Irish patriot who gave a speech in Paris in 1848 which was deemed to be seditious. So he was transported to Van Diemen's Land, now Tasmania for life, and he had the good sense to escape. No one quite knows when Australia became independent. You know when the US became independent. It's a matter of debate in our country when we became independent. Our colonies federated and formed the Commonwealth of Australia in 1901, but we didn't have full independence in terms of foreign and defence policy at that point, and that emerged over time. And when Great Britain declared war on Germany in September of 1939, our then Prime Minister Robert Menzies went on radio, there was no TV in Australia at the time, went on radio and said, my fellow countrymen, it's my melancholy duty to inform you that Great Britain has declared war on Germany, and as a consequence, Australia is also at war. And that was an unremarkable statement at the time. But when the Japanese came into the war, when they attacked Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December 1941, we were faced in early 42 with the possibility of invasion, and that's when the relationship between our two countries really picked up in quite a marked way, although it's not where it started. In terms of geography, we're about the same size as the 48 states. However, we're not an island. If you know your geology, then you know that it's not possible to be an island and a continent at the same time. But we are surrounded by water. And what that means is that, one, we have a big land mass. Secondly, we have a big coastline. And being populated by only 21 million people, we're sparsely populated. And that means we have to think very carefully about our defence force structure. And that in part explains the reason why, measured in absolute dollar terms, Australia has the 11th or 12th largest defence budget in the world. We're very dry. You guys living here in Utah live in a dry part of your country, but let me paint this picture. Stand in the middle of the US and you stand in Kansas or Missouri, depending upon what side of the argument you're on. You stand in a part of your country that gets 30 inches of rain a year. You have great big river systems flowing through it, and you have topsoil you measure in feet, and you have cities of 1 million or more people around you. Stand in the middle of Australia, and you stand in a part of that third of our continent that receives less than 10 inches of rain a year. There are no permanent river systems. The topsoil where it exists in the middle of Australia you measure in centimetres, and the largest city for 1,000 kilometres in any direction is Alice Springs with 25,000 people. So the contrast between our two countries in terms of geography is really quite stark. In terms of our economy, we're the world's 14th largest economy. Our economy, like yours, our exports are commodity, rural, manufactured based. With the commodity boom, we have a lot of what the world wants. We're the world's largest coal exporter, not the world's largest coal producer, but the world's largest coal exporter. One of the big exporters of iron ore and all of that. And we have the energy that a lot of people want in this century. We're one of the world's biggest LNG exporters. We have 40% of the world's commercially recoverable uranium. And as I said, we're a big coal exporter. So in terms of what people want over the next 100 years, we have a lot of it. However, our economy is like yours, is overwhelmingly service-based. About 80% of our economy is in services. Now, in terms of people, 21 million, as I said, 24% of all Australians were born overseas. Now, to put that in context, 12 to 13% of Americans were born overseas. And even if you add your illegals, it doesn't get you much beyond 15 or so. So 24% of all Australians were born overseas. And 21 million Australians have over 12 million passports. 300 million Americans have about a bit over 60 million passports. So you put all that together and you put the fact that 20% of our economy is traded globally compared to about 12% of yours. And you see that we're very globally oriented. We are a country not only with regional interests, we're a country also with significant global interests. In terms of Australia and the US, it's the depth and the breadth of the relationship that really stands out. In terms of our economic relationship, you're our third largest trading partner. We're your 14th largest trading partner. Bear in mind there are 192 countries that make up the UN. So when I say we're your 14th largest trading partner, it means we're a bigger trading partner than some 178 other countries. Our investment is very big. You're by far our largest foreign investor in Australia, but we're your eighth or ninth largest foreign investor here in the US. About 38% of all of our foreign investment, Australian foreign investment, comes into the US. So the economic relationship is really quite big. And in terms of people to people, about 100 to 130,000 Australians live and work in the US, and you find them in all walks of life, including in this room. We've had a formal defence alliance since 1951, but we've fought in all wars together since April of 1917, when the United States entered World War I. Since then, in every major conflict, we have fought together. And a bit of historical trivia for you, we're your only major ally with whom you have not ever been at war with. Every other major ally you have, at one point or another, you have been at war with. That may say something about your allies rather than you. So this then is the backdrop to the embassy's work. There's about 300 people who work in the Australian Embassy in Washington, and we have about another 150 odd people working in another 18 or so cities around the US. So what do we do? Essentially what an embassy does, or what a good embassy does in Washington, is three things. We're one, the Australian taxpayer-funded think tank in Washington. Secondly, we're the Australian taxpayer-funded lobby group in Washington. And thirdly, we're the Australian taxpayer-funded provider of functional services, whether that be in trade, whether it be in education, whether it be in consular services, or indeed in immigration. So, what are the broad strategic issues that are important to the embassy in Washington? There are four strategic issues that we have as an embassy. One is the trans-Pacific relationships encompassing the United States, China, Japan and India. Now those relationships are important to us because those relationships fundamentally determine the politico-strategic environment in which we as a country live. Therefore, whether it's our embassies in New Delhi, Beijing or Tokyo or in Washington, we have an influence in seeking to influence and shape those relationships to the limited extent that we can, consistent with our national interests. And I think one of the real unremarked successes of the administration over the last 6 years has been the simultaneous improvement in the bilateral relationship that the US has managed with each of India, China and Japan. I think if you were to have gone back 7 years and suggested that come 2007, the US would have significantly improved and better relationships with each of those countries, I think a lot of people would have challenged you on that. And despite the emotion which sits below or is very public in the relationship between the US and China, particularly on the trade front, nonetheless your administration has, from our perspective, managed those sets of relationships remarkably well. A second set of issues of strategic importance to the embassy resides in the economic and trade area. 20% of our economy is traded. Therefore, we have an interest in the right outcome in the Doha round. Therefore, we have an interest, whether it be with the EU, whether it be with Brazil or India, or indeed here in the US, we have an interest in giving some of the major players a shove in the right direction. We have a real interest in respect of your farm bill, and that takes me up to the Congress from time to time. Why do we have an interest in your farm bill? We have an interest in your farm bill because 75% of our agricultural product is exported. And your farm bill, your farm support measures distort the international trading environment for our farming products. Therefore, we have an interest in making representations to your Congress about ways in which support can be given to farmers without distorting the international trading environment. A third strategic issue is in the defence arena. I mentioned we have a formal alliance, but we also purchase a lot of our defence equipment from the US. And whenever we have a major defence procurement program, we have an interest in seeking to ensure that we get access to the right technology and also to the right information that goes with the weapon systems. And that's always, if you take your Joint Strike Fighter, that's a big multinational project being put together by Lockheed Martin, overwhelmingly financed by the US government. But we have a heavy financial stake in it, and we will probably end up purchasing somewhere between $16 to $17 billion worth of the Joint Strike Fighters. Therefore, we've got an interest in what your Congress allocates to a project like that. So when you have defence appropriations come up, we have an interest, because of the way your governmental system is set up and works, we have an interest not only in working with your administration, but also in working with your Congress on projects of that type. And recently in Sydney, the President and the Australian Prime Minister signed a defence trade cooperation treaty. Your country has only signed 2 of these treaties, one with the UK and one with Australia. And that is a treaty which will make it easier, subject to approval by the 2/3 of the Senate, as all your treaties require. Subject to Senate approval, it will mean that our defence industries are able to work more closely together. It will make it easier for us to interopt with one another, and it will cut down on the significant bureaucratic delays that are involved in getting defence technology and information out of the system as it's currently established. A 4th area of strategic interest for us is in the counter-terrorism arena, and that encompasses both diplomatic, law enforcement, intelligence, and also our military. Following 9/11, we in fact, following the attack on you on 9/11, we in fact activated the ANZUS Treaty for the first time. In other words, we took a decision that the attack on you on the 11th of September 2001 was also an attack on us. So that treaty was in fact activated for the first time by either party. We have been involved in Afghanistan from the beginning with military on the ground, and we have been involved in Iraq from the beginning with military on the ground. We also have an interest with you when it comes to proliferation issues relating to North Korea and also relating to Iran. So across the full dimension of counter-terrorism, we have a real interest, and that interest means something for us. While it's an artificial starting point, nonetheless, it's a point worth noting that since 9/11, more Australian civilians have been killed in terrorist attacks than have US civilians, than have British civilians, than have French civilians, or indeed German civilians. So while we have not suffered an attack on our own soil, we have lost a lot of people offshore, particularly in Indonesia. And we have had planning for terrorist attacks in Australia, and there are around 30 people in prison in Australia at present, either serving sentences for terrorism-relating offences or awaiting trial on terrorism-related charges. The final point I'd make is in respect of global leadership. From where we sit, US global leadership is essential. It is overwhelmingly a force for good in the world. As the world's sole superpower, you are faced with pressure from all quarters. Inevitably, decision-making does not make everyone happy. You do cop more than a fair degree of criticism globally. And of course, a war like Iraq is as controversial in Australia as what it is here in the US. But nonetheless, your country's involvement globally is essential, and it is overwhelmingly a force for good. That's all I wanted to say by way of intro. Very happy to quickly move on, and we've got another 23 minutes. I said I'd talk for between 20-25 minutes, so we've got a good length of time for questions, and very happy to take them on anything I've covered or indeed on anything else.
Hi, I was wondering, regarding the US-Australia Free Trade Agreement that was reached several years ago, were there any issues regarding that agreement over which Australian citizens and or government officials were upset, such as the US not budging at all on reducing sugar can't think of
quotas and tariffs. Yep.
Yeah.
All right. Well, look, the Australia-US Free Trade Agreement came into effect on 1 January 2005. We didn't get everything we wanted, and you didn't get everything you wanted. We were disappointed with the outcome on sugar, and we were disappointed that we didn't get quite as much movement as we wanted in a couple of other areas. Equally, the US pharmaceutical industry was and also the US government was disappointed that it didn't get what it wanted in that arena. So it was a classical negotiation where both sides had to give a bit, and yes, both sides walked away with not getting everything they wanted. That's life.
How are the ties today with Indonesia, with President Yudhoyono? How do you guys feel about his presidency and about the government in Indonesia?
Yep. President Yudhoyono, well, first of all, the relationship between Australia and Indonesia, you can make two comments about it. One, it is overwhelmingly in good shape. Indonesia is very important to us, and we're very important to Indonesia. Secondly, historically, there have always been issues from time to time which are sensitive on one side or the other. So if you go back from the time of Indonesia's independence in the 1940s, whether it be East Timor, whether it be issues of terrorism immediately following 9/11, or whether it be issues relating to refugees, there have always been a few issues which from time to time come to the surface and which need to be managed. What I think stands out when you look at all of that is that overwhelmingly both successive Australian and successive Indonesian governments has had a commitment to resolve those issues as they've come along. President Yudhoyono, we think, is doing a remarkably good job in Indonesia. We think Indonesia deserves support globally and also from the US. We very much welcomed the restoration of military-to-military ties between the United States and Indonesia a bit over a year ago. And we did that because we take the view that any country that considers democracy, terrorism, and the challenges of certain terrorist groups seeking to take advantage or seeking to hide themselves within Islam, any countries that consider that those issues are important today ought to give a lot of attention to Indonesia. Why? Because Indonesia is the world's largest Islamic country. It is the world's third largest democracy after India and the United States. It's a fledgling democracy. Its institutions are still being put down. If you look at where Indonesia has moved over the last 10 years, 10 years ago President Suharto was in power. You look at the circumstances in which he moved from power. You look at the uncertainty it followed from that, and you look at where Indonesia is now. Indonesia is a good news story, and if you're concerned about democracy, if you're concerned about terrorism, Indonesia has led the way, and we think we have a very strong view in respect of the relationship and the importance of Indonesia, and we don't hesitate in Washington and elsewhere to make our views on that known, and we welcome the steps that the administration has taken in recent years to in fact significantly upgrade its relationship with Indonesia. We think it's been precisely the right thing to do. You're being ignored, but we will come to you.
Sorry, I just thought I
That's
saw
okay.
your hand
No,
raised.
not at all.
With respect to the popular opinion in Iraq, here it seems that the country is like the majority of them are kind of against what's going on in Iraq. How does that compare with the popular opinion of the Australians to the war in Iraq?
Okay, polling in Australia is not dissimilar to polling here in the US, in that one, a clear majority of Australians do not like the war in Iraq and question whether we should have been part of it. Secondly, the answers become more complex when you ask people about withdrawal of troops from Iraq. So if you look at opinion polls in Australia, they're not dissimilar to opinion polls here. It's right. Fella up there's been desperate.
My question is personal. In considering a life in foreign service, my question to you and your wife is, what has been the hardest part of foreign service on your family? And secondly, how have you attempted to deal with that challenge, if there be any challenge to your family?
Well, I can only speak for myself, one half of the equation, and at the risk of being overruled, I need to be very careful. This is where the skills of being an ambassador really come to the fore. First of all, I'm not a career diplomat in the real sense of the word. I was in our foreign ministry from 69 to 86, but I left it in 86. Therefore, the organisation to which I now belong, the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, would no longer consider me a true career diplomat because I left the foreign ministry in 86 and went off and did other things in government. I would simply make the point that, are there issues? Yes. Are there challenges? Yes, in respect of family. However, I believe the bottom line is that those issues are manageable, and also I'm personally, I am doubtful that the issues that a family might run into in the context of overseas service and the like, very often they're issues you might run into anyway, even if you'd remained at home. So yes, there are particular dimensions, but I wouldn't have thought they're the sorts of challenges which should make you hesitate in going into the career if that's what you're inclined to do. So go for it.
Hi, my question regards the Kyoto Protocol. There's been a lot of criticism because the U.S. and Australia are two countries that have refused to sign it, whereas 107 countries around the world have.
Yep.
I was wondering why Australia has refused to sign the Kyoto Protocols and what you see as the future of their relationship with that agreement.
Okay. In fact, Al Gore was in Australia a few weeks ago, and he described Australia and the US as the Bonnie and Clyde of climate change. And I don't know who was Bonnie and who was Clyde. I didn't read it that closely. But no, the Australian government did not sign Kyoto because it believed it was Eurocentric. It believed that excluding the countries it did made no sense, even though the emission goal that we would have had to have met under Kyoto, we will meet. There's an election in Australia at the moment, or it will take place on the 24th of November. and the opposition in Australia is committed to signing Kyoto, even though it's late in the day. So there is that active debate. It goes on in Australia. I would simply make the observation here, or it's an observation I make in Australia about the US, and if I can be so bold, I'll make it here. And that is, to me, it is inconceivable that any US administration of any colour or shape could sign up to Kyoto 2 without a very clear and unambiguous pathway into the agreement for China, for especially China and also India. I don't believe your domestic politics would allow that, and indeed I think it would be very difficult for the American people to sign up to Kyoto 2 in the event of what is now the world's largest emitter in China being exempted from it. I don't think it will come to that. I believe a way will be found to move forward which will encompass all countries, or most countries, one way or the other. But that's giving you a little bit more than what you asked for, but it
Okay. My question is, what are your feelings about the U.S. action towards New Zealand involving the ANZUS Treaty, and has it affected Australia in any bad way?
It hasn't materially affected Australia in a negative way, except that there are certain things militarily which we used to do as a threesome, which we now do as a duo. And that is disappointing. It is understandable it is understandable the action that the US took in respect of New Zealand over 20 years ago, given that given New Zealand's position in respect of visits by nuclear-powered, possibly nuclear-armed warships. Now, in recent years, both New Zealand and the US, I think, have put in an effort to improve their bilateral relationships, and they've done that, and that is something that we very much welcome. We are supportive of an improvement in the US-New Zealand relationship across the full spectrum, recognising that there are certain specific areas of the relationship that will not get back to where they were simply because New Zealand has a different view on certain things to what, say, Australia does.
Having been an historical military ally of the United States, and with the situation with Iran likely seeking a nuclear weapon in the future, what is Australia's position of concerning Iran, particularly considering that there's an idea now of using military force towards Iran?
Well, I don't believe. In respect of Iran, I would make this comment. I would take what the administration says publicly on face value, because I believe that is the administration's policy. The administration, and Condoleezza Rice said it this morning in a joint press conference that that Secretary Rice and Secretary Paulson gave this morning, announcing enhanced sanctions against Iran. Secretary Rice said that the US remained committed to a diplomatic solution, and everything that I see suggests that that is in fact the case. If you look at the effort the administration has put within the framework of the UN Security Council, you look at in the effort they've put in working with the Europeans, particularly the French, the Germans, and and the British. I think the US genuinely does want a diplomatic resolution. Equally, the administration has not taken all options off the table, and clearly, working from first principles, one can understand why the administration would not take all options off the table. I think my own personal view is that the media reports you see from time to time about the administration gearing up for military action in the short term, I think is probably overstated. Equally, I believe there's an obligation on the part of the international community to work vigorously for a diplomatic resolution. No, if you wish to avoid armed conflict, then clearly you have an interest in working within the framework of the UN to, in fact, bring about a diplomatic resolution, which means countries that are permanent members of the UN Security Council and members of the UN generally have an interest in working with the US and others to exert diplomatic and other pressure on Iran in respect of their nuclear program. No one denies Iran's right to nuclear energy. The concern, as you know, relates to their enrichment program and the question marks that hang over the purpose of that.
Has the war in Iraq affected Australian public sentiment toward how has that affected our relations? Or has the frustration mainly been directed at the conflict itself? Or are Australians beginning to question whether or not you should have such deep ties with the U.S.? Okay,
the polling would suggest that the war in Iraq has affected US standing in Australia, as it has done elsewhere. The polling also shows very clearly that it has not affected to any significant degree attitudes towards the alliance. In recent polling, over 90% of Australians consider the alliance with the United States to be either of great importance or of importance. In other words, there's a real commitment to the alliance, and people, and I think it's quite reasonable, there's no contradiction between that and the standing generally of the US and Australia having been negatively affected, in part because of Iraq.
Sharing such historical ties with the United States, how has the Australian government taken to receiving, if in the case, has Australians received international attention or criticism trying to keep such close ties to the United States, and how they've reacted?
Okay, it is a matter of open debate in Australia. There are some Australians who believe we are too close. The Australian governments have been too close to the US. So that is a matter that gets debated within Australia. I don't believe our relationship with the US has negatively affected our capacity to work with other countries. If I look at our relationships within Southeast Asia, within East Asia, within elsewhere, I don't see how it's affected us. For instance, you have not had diplomatic relations with Iran since 1979, and understandably. We do have diplomatic relations with Iran, and we have an embassy and an ambassador in Tehran. So we have a very close relationship. We have a very close alliance relationship, but that doesn't mean that everything you do, we do, or indeed vice versa. And I see no evidence that the closeness of our relationship with the US has negatively affected to any significant degree our wider and global set of relationships. I can see where, I'll take one last question. I can see it's come, I know you guys have to disappear at 10:02. I was told that you all fly out the door at 10:02. So is there one more? Yeah, and I'll take one more, and we'll answer it within 30 seconds, and that means you won't turn into pumpkins.
This may be the subject of your next lecture here on campus, but briefly, how are your relationships with China, and how do you feel that their growing economy is going to impact yours?
Okay, our relationship with China is indeed very good. We've had an excellent relationship with China over more than 25 years. The growth of the Chinese economy is not something that has so much taken us by surprise. In the 1980s, the then Australian government commissioned a study by a leading Australian economist. It came out in 1988, and it was entitled The Northeast Asian Ascendancy. It was about the economic growth in China and in Korea and in Japan and where that was taking us. We are a beneficiary of China's growth insofar as we have the raw materials that they require in order to grow their economy. Equally, we have competitive pressures in our manufacturing industry arising from China. That causes debate and concern from time to time, but we do not have anything equal to your massive trade deficit with China, which feeds the understandable debate here. But as I said previously, I think from where we sit, your administration has managed its relationship with China very well. But our relationship with China is in very good shape and is important to us. We are friends with China and with the United States. We're allies with one. Thank you.